Okay, welcome to the next in our series of presentations, lessons on labour markets. This is the one you've all been waiting for, the gender pay gap. So our first key point with the gender pay gap is that gender pay, or the gender pay gap, is not the same as equal pay. So gender pay gap is not the same as equal pay. For 50 years now, women have had the right to equal pay between men and women for equal work. And that Equal Pay Act of 1970 was superseded by the Equality Act of 2010. But for many, many years now, women have had a right to equal pay for equal work. So the gender pay gap is not talking about equal pay for equal work. We're not comparing like with like. And the definition of the gender pay gap from the ONS is given to you in the last bullet there. So it's the percentage difference between male and female median hourly earnings. It's not a measure of the difference in pay between men and women for doing the same job. So you have to get that very clear in your minds before we go any further. We're not talking about equal pay for equal work. Rather, we are talking about unequal pay for different kinds of work. That's what we're dealing with here. So let's now briefly have a look at some gender pay statistics for 2019. Companies are not obliged to report statistics for 2020, so these are the latest ones that are available. So the gender pay gap for all employees, that's full-time and part-time workers, is 17.3%. Now that is quite high, but when we adjust for the fact that women make up a disproportionately large amount of part-time employees, then if we just look at the gender pay gap for full-time employees, it is 8.9%. So that is still a big gap, but it's maybe not quite as big a gap as you sometimes see reported in the media. The media tend to report the first figure there and tend not to place quite as much emphasis on the second one. We should also say that the gender pay gap is falling and has fallen consistently throughout the 2010s, although it is falling very, very slowly. However, when we do look at different age groups, then a slightly different pattern does emerge. What you tend to find is the gender pay gap is almost zero for age groups under 40. And the gap tends to get wider for age groups over 40. We can have a think about some of the reasons why that might be. So that there starts off being really no gender pay gap when you graduate, when you get out of university and do your first job. But then as time goes on, as you get older, then the gap starts to widen. We'll have a think about why that might be. One of the businesses that's been in or was in the headlines, again, when this was a big issue, it's still a big issue, of course, but the gender pay statistics tended to be more reported in the media maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years ago. Other things have taken over, as we know, in the last few months. But if the case of EasyJet was highlighted a lot in the media. So there is a big gender pay gap in EasyJet, as there is in many airlines. So male workers are paid hourly. The median hourly earnings of males in EasyJet is £24.91, and for females it is £13.26, which gives us a gender pay gap of 46.8% between male and female, although this is slightly down on the previous year's figure. Now you might think, right, well, that is hugely big pay gap and is egregiously wide, but when we dig a little bit into the statistics, the reasons for it become a bit more clear. So there's no evidence that this is down to discrimination. Of course, there could be cases of discrimination, but there's no evidence of it. When we look at the nature of the jobs taken by males and females in EasyJet, we see that 94% of pilots are male, 6% of pilots are female. Whereas for cabin crew, 71% of cabin crew are female, 29% are male. And of course, cabin crew are paid much less than pilots. And look back at the lesson on wage differentials if you want to know why pilots are paid more than cabin crew. So the problem is not that males and females are paid different amounts for the same job. The problem is that there aren't enough female pilots. There aren't enough females able or willing, for whatever reason, to go for those top paid jobs. That's the real issue. So I'd like you now to pause the screen and have a think about what might be the possible causes of the earnings gap between males and females. So what are the possible causes of the earnings gap? Pause the screen and we'll come back. So well done if you got any of these. The first one is, as we've already alluded to, a disproportionately large number of women work in part-time work, and disproportionately large amount of or number of males work in full-time work. One is societal pressures, and I'll come to exactly what that means and the nature of that. You may already have some ideas about what that might refer to. One is due to the different types of occupations that women do compared to what men do. So divisions in the labour market. And another possible explanation is discrimination. So even though discrimination is illegal, that doesn't necessarily mean that it might not go on. We've seen already that just because there is a national minimum wage, that doesn't stop employers paying their workers sometimes less than the national minimum wage. So discrimination could be a reason. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some of the reasons for the gender pay gap. So one is part-time work. Now, you might think, well, obviously part-time workers work fewer hours, so obviously they're going to earn less than full-time workers. But remember, the gender pay gaps are in terms of hourly earnings. So even when you adjust for the reduced number of hours worked by part-time workers, there is still a pay gap. So why do part-time workers get paid less per hour than full-time workers? One is that they usually have less influence in the organization, so they might have less say in terms of who gets paid what. But also they will have fewer chances of promotion. They tend to get passed over for things like promotions. When you often it is women who are part-time, as we've said, and quite often people take part-time work after they've had a family, so after they've had children. And initially, when you switch from full-time to part-time work, your hourly wage just doesn't fall. But then over time, your wage rate tends to fall behind. So this, again, as we said, is probably because you might have fewer chances of promotion. So is it because you don't want a chance of promotion, or is it because you're trying to get promoted but you're being left out? That's the question which economists are still really trying to find the answers to. So second reason is to do with societal pressures. So even today in 2020, women still do much of the housework and childcare, tasks around the home. And it's also the case, even today, that quite often the family follows the male member of the family's career. So if the man gets promoted and that involves the family having to move house, then that's what will happen. Family moves house. And then when you relocate, it's unfortunately the woman is left to settle for whatever job she can get in the same region or the same location. It is also, there is statistical evidence of the fact that for whatever reason, women are less willing to undergo longer commutes. So for all these reasons, women are often less geographically mobile on average. So a third one is to do with occupational segregation. This is the different types of jobs done by women and men. So retail is a good example. There's a disproportionately large number of women work in shops, work in retailing. Now, retailing is an example of a job which is labor intensive. And if it's labor intensive, that means it's not capital intensive. And if jobs are not capital intensive and you've got less capital per worker, then those workers will have a lower marginal revenue product and therefore they will be paid less. So we're not saying that women have lower MRP. We're just saying that in the sorts of jobs where women are disproportionately represented, they have lower capital per worker and therefore lower MRP and lower pay. It's the jobs really that demand lower MRP. It's nothing to do with women having less MRP than men. Alongside this, we've got the old problem which you guys are familiar with of degree choice and STEM. So not enough women are doing science, technology, engineering degrees, that kind of thing. And hopefully you've seen with the wage differentials lesson, and you will see when we do occupational mobility of labour, and you may well have seen that lesson already, that engineers are massively in shortage in the UK, big shortage of engineers, and the wage rate commanded by engineers and mathematicians, those kind of jobs, are very, very high. But there's not enough women doing degrees in these kind of subjects and not enough graduates going in for these kinds of jobs. Economics, incidentally, is another area which has been traditionally far too dominated by men. So now we come to discrimination, which is quite an easy thing to point to in terms of why is there a gender pay issue, but it's perhaps for me the least convincing reason for discrimination, the reason for the wage gap. It's usually a bit more subtle than just saying, well, there is discrimination. That's not to say there isn't discrimination. There may well be isolated cases of discrimination, but economic theory doesn't really back it up, except under specialist circumstances. And the evidence wouldn't uncover it anyway, even if there was. So we can't really say that there is evidence, either theoretical or statistical, of discrimination on the average. For a start, discrimination is not possible if the firm is a wage taker. So we saw in the perfectly competitive labour market situation that the perfectly competitive firm faces a horizontal supply curve. They have no wage setting power. Remember the Lego video. Well, many labour markets are not perfectly competitive, okay. But even if the labour market is not perfectly competitive, if the business is competing aggressively with other firms in the product market, then its discrimination may still not be possible. Perhaps it could well be that nobody wants to work for you. They'll go and work for somebody else, maybe in another occupation. And you might get your customers not keen on buying from you as well. Trade unions may also have something to say about this. So discrimination is, it may not be possible if you're competing in the product market with other firms that are not discriminating. It may be possible, however, if the business has monopoly power in the labour market and price setting power in the product market. Discrimination is possible under these specialized sets of circumstances. Again, any pressure to end discrimination here might have to come from things like trade unions or customers or possibly shareholders. So the theory is only in that one specialist circumstance that we could say perhaps that discrimination is possible. And the evidence doesn't really uncover it because, as we've said, the gender pay gap statistics are not comparing like with like. You're comparing different jobs, not the same job. So even if there is discrimination, the gender pay gap statistics don't uncover it. Here's a question. If women are like men, only cheaper, why would a profit maximizing firm not demand more women? So why, if you're a business and you realize that women were cheaper, why would you not employ more women? And then, of course, demand for women would go up and the wage rate would go up. So why do you think that is not the case? Pause the video. Right, finally, what policies would you adopt if you were the government to close the gender pay gap? So we agree there's a gender pay gap and it's a big issue and it needs to be cut. So what would you do? Pause the video and we'll see if your ideas are the same as my ideas. So one policy which the UK government actually adopted in 2015 is shared parental leave. So this is acknowledging that a lot of the gender pay gap starts to arise once women have taken a career break to have children, and then they go back to work. Maybe they tend to take more part-time roles, and the gender pay gap rises over time with age. Now, if males take or share much more of the parental leave, and women don't take that career break or don't take as long a career break, then that problem might be reduced. One of the problems here is that the take-up has been low, and it might take time for people to change their approach. It might take time for it to become acceptable in society's eyes for men to share more of the parental leave. One, of course, is sort of naming and shaming. So we have gender pay gap reporting. So even though the EasyJet statistics are misleading, at least the gender pay issue becomes in the news. Even if people slightly misunderstand the statistics, at least the issue is out there, and we can talk about it, and we can try and take measures to reduce the gap. So I don't know if it's as a result of reporting or whatever, but EasyJet are targeting an increase in the number of new cadet pilots that are female. They're targeting, I think, 20%. The 20% of all new cadet pilots will be female by this year, by 2020, and we'll see if they manage to do that. Clearly, with airlines having suffered so much in the current climate, it could well be that recruiting is very, very low, and so the statistics might not necessarily bear this out, but we'll see. Improved government provision of childcare and nurseries, again, so that people can prolong have their career coexisting along with childcare responsibilities or bringing up a child. And similarly, to incentivize the provision of creche facilities by employers. So you could provide subsidies, or you could give a tax incentive, or you could simply pass a law saying that there has to be certain creche facilities provided. The big issue, of course, with numbers 3 and 4 might be the cost, government cost, opportunity cost, impact on budget deficits and that sort of thing. And we just mentioned earlier targets or quotas for better paid jobs. So we had the EasyJet example. There's a big campaign about having more women in finance and other occupations. There's a bit of a campaign at the moment trying to get more women into economics. Some countries have a target of, say, 20 or 25% of chief executives of the largest companies. So we could, for example, in the UK, have a target that 25% or 30% of all FTSE 100 chief executives are female. That's an idea that's been touted for quite a long time. And just to finish, a couple of evaluation points. So if you look at the ONS interactive graphic that I've put on the stream, you can look at the gender pay gap across all sorts of different occupations. And as we know, it is positive for most occupations. That is to say, women are paid less than men. But the gender pay gap is negative for other occupations. So counsellors is one example. Bar staff, I think, is an example. Vets is an example where women are paid more than men. Fitness instructors. The biggest gap is archivists and curators. So on average, women are paid 35% more if they're an archivist or a curator than men are for the same occupation. So this is a good evaluation point to put in the exam. The gender pay gap overall is positive. That is to say, women are paid less than men, but that is not the same for all occupations. So interesting thing to note there. And it is also negative for part-time workers, interestingly. So your average female part-time worker is paid more than your average male part-time worker. Gender pay gap is only positive when we look at full-time employees. The data also excludes overtime payments, which could have some influence. I would have thought quite a small influence, but there is some dispute over some of the data. The gender pay data does exclude overtime payments. And for some of the occupations that we just talked about, some of the sample sizes are quite small as well. So there could be sampling error that would make the data inaccurate. And it's a good general evaluation point that you can make. You could always comment on the accuracy and reliability of data, even either in an essay or in a data response as well. Look at the source, look at where it's come from, who's published it. But if you know one or two little bits and bobs about certain topics here, as we say for the gender pay gap, there is some suggestion that some of the sample sizes might be quite small, and so some of the data could be inaccurate. Okay, hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you for the next labour market lesson.